world around us and making sure that we are contributing to this. And so in this age of environmental awareness, I'm really asking, how can we consider theatre production in a way that aligns with our eco-cultural values? And importantly, if we think about bringing an ecological perspective to our work, how do we make sure that this is seen and we approach it as an opportunity and not a constraint? And I think that's what the focus of our workshop in the second part of today is, really about looking at the lens of opportunity and serendipity and allowing things to co-emerge with what is around us. And so the concept of ecoscenography came through my PhD and postdoctoral work, and my book, which was written in 2021, published in 2021, which was really exploring a new framework for theatre making and really thinking about how do we make theatre in an age of environmental fragility. And I talk about this in the book a lot, about, you know, my early days of being a stage designer and when I was approaching other theatre makers and directors about what I was trying to do in trying to focus on a more sustainable way of doing things, I was met with a lot of negative comments. A lot of assumptions around what sustainability would mean, even when people hadn't really delved into it. There was this assumption that if we were going to work in a sustainable way, that it would be expensive, that it would be boring, restrictive, time-consuming. A limitation on aesthetics was a really big one that people loved to talk about, and that it actually just would not be high quality enough. And even somebody told me that theatre and sustainability just don't mix, so we shouldn't even bother trying. And I mean, these are just a few of the comments that I've received. These are literally things that people said to me. I think we've come a long way since then, but I think a lot of those assumptions still prevail. And I think it's really important that we don't get sort of bound up in these assumptions, that they don't become realities, that we actually need time to investigate what this means. And again, looking through a lens of opportunity is important. And I think it's not a surprise that we tend to see sustainability as something that is going to be a limitation, right? We see sustainability as something that is negative. It's a problem to solve. And so this lens of looking at it as a problem already puts us off on a different way of looking at the world. So we see sustainability as a problem rather than an opportunity. And this glass half empty approach has not helped. And we need to see sustainability actually as thrivability, really thinking from a place of abundance and not scarcity. And when you think from a place of abundance, everything is possible. Suddenly new things emerge, new opportunities, and there's space for everyone to be part of the conversation. So that's at the heart of ecoscenography, really about embracing opportunities of ecological design for performance. It's really about seeing the world as an interconnected social ecological system, one that really merges the biological, mental, social, and cultural. It's about understanding that the human and the non-human are inextricably entangled across bodies, substances, and ecosystems, that there's no such thing as a way that our practices have consequences, and simply put, waste is a failure of the imagination. And what I'm really interested in my research that I'm doing at the moment is this notion of eco-creativity. So sort of moving along, beyond these ideas of eco-efficiency, which is something that we often talk about in a kind of more capitalist neoliberal society. You know, how can we be less bad? How can we just kind of, do less? Those kind of considerations are important when we talk about mitigation of impact, but I'm much more interested in what we as a performing arts, as practitioners and artists, what we have that is unique to us and to this conversation around sustainability. So this notion of eco-creativity is about, this question of how we fuse artistic imagination or innovation with ecological transformation. So that is where our strengths lie as artists and makers. And a lot of this has to do with when we come back down to it, is if we want to work in an ecological way, fundamentally, on a philosophical standpoint, it's about really thinking, what is my relationship to the world around me? What is my relationship to space? What is my relationship to place, to the objects, to the materials, and my fellow humans and non-humans that are part of this world? And so that is a kind of creative expansion, this idea of widening of identity, of what it means to kind of shift from this individual practitioner framework to one that not only acknowledges obviously our co-practitioners, our human co-practitioners, but also the more than human, multiple interconnections across communities and environments in the making of the work that we do. And Sean Espion Hagens, who is an integral theorist, he talks about this shift from essentially from the egocentric all the way to the cosmocentric. It's like this kind of way of viewing and connecting to the world. So if we look at the world around us, we can see very clearly that, you know, nature does things pretty well in terms of waste-free ways of being and doing. We can actually take inspiration from nature. This is actually called biomimicry, when we actually take inspiration from nature and start to think about how we can also design in relation to that, and how we can move from a more linear way of doing things to something that is much more cyclical. And thinking about how we can actually learn from nature and 3.8 billion years of creating beneficial life enhancing conditions. So I think, you know, there's a sense of humility that we also have to have with the ecosystem that we are part and the natural world around us, and humility in sort of thinking about how we can learn from that. So, and if, again, you know, as I mentioned, there's no such thing as waste in nature. But the other thing is interesting to me is that when you look at species, and particularly if you look at like the grub to the butterfly metamorphosis, you'll notice that living systems do not value one stage of living over another. Instead, it's all part of a further becoming in which every part of the journey is crucial and valued. And so this is where my idea of ecoscenography as a kind of framework for thinking about theatre production came from. Really about sort of going out into nature and starting to observe the world around me, and starting to think in a more ecologically connected way. And part of what I was interested in is we focus a lot on making theatre and producing theatre work for our audiences, but we don't often account for the unmaking of our practices. And this I see as a missed opportunity. So a lot of my questioning around reframing theatre production is how can we move our focus beyond the performance season to one that also acknowledges and celebrates the making and unmaking of our practices? So how do we make space for that? How do we also make this part of the creative work, or what we might call in German, the Gesamtkunstwerk, the holistic experience of theatre making? So ecoscenography is actually reframing pre-production, production, and post-production into the 3 Cs, or what I call the 3 Cs, which essentially is co-creation, celebration, and circulation. So the 3 Cs essentially are reimagining the 3 Ps, as we can see there. And I'm going to unpack these for you very quickly, and just to show you some examples of how this could be done in theatre practice. So co-creation is essentially the making of the work. And in co-creation, it's about really thinking about what's available to me now in this place. So working from a place-based perspective, being open to local and serendipitous opportunities, being relational, allowing what's available, found objects, materials, processes, people that we can actually work with. So rather than coming up with a preconceived idea of how to make a theatre work, we are actually being inspired by the world around us. So the biggest mistake I see also in my own experience as a designer is, for example, in a conventional theatre context, I read a play, then I come up with an idea around the play that is actually devoid of the materials and resources that I have around me. I just come up with an idea in my head. And I think it's really important that if we want to work in a sustainable way, the first point of call is to actually work with what we have here and now. And the other thing is not working in isolation. So how can we work together more as a community to share resources? So Donielle Worley essentially worked in a way with a lot of materials that she found in junkyards in New York City. And she did this on Broadway for Peter and the Starcatcher and many of her Broadway and off-Broadway productions. And she really talks about this idea that any kind of trash can be material. You get this stuff and you wrestle with it. And all the time I'm like, okay, this is what we've got. This is what's in front of us. How do we use it? And that relationship to material is really like a key part of her process. And she even reinvented the typical design process on Broadway in order to do that. Andrea Carr is a UK designer, and she was looking at abandoned festival tents and sleeping bags and creating extraordinary costumes and set designs from them. Celia Kieser, who's a Norwegian designer, was cleaning up waterways in Norway to create her stage designs. And the relationship between the process and the aesthetics and the outcome is obviously closely linked as part of the storytelling. But of course, found objects and materials is something that we've been using and doing a lot in theatre, and we might think that maybe they've had a bit of a resurgence in the context of the environmental framework. But I've also seen a lot of interest in biomaterials, so working with organic materials. So in this case, this is a work by Ingvild Fossheim. She's actually based in Finland, and she works a lot with natural dyes to create the beautiful colors that you see in the costume on stage. And what I love about this work is place is literally on stage through the colors of the environment and the way in which they are part of the garments that the actors are wearing on stage. And I think that's incredibly powerful as well for storytelling. She's also worked a lot with sort of unusual materials, different kinds of, organic processes. Some, she's saying are more experimental than others, for example, using SCOBY or kombucha. But interesting to kind of explore how this also, in the context of the dancers and the performers, changes the way they move and they relate to the space or to the costume or the materials. And then in my work, this is a work that I did for Federation Square in Melbourne in 2016, so quite a while now, from now. But it was really about co-creating installations and artworks with communities. And we also worked with horticulturists and ecologists to talk about the local ecology and the importance of biodiversity in the city. But the whole sculpture and the making of the sculpture and the installation was really in a public space. So there's something really powerful when you have people co-creating and making in a public space and transforming that, and they all come to see their installation because they've all been part of it. And the second stage is celebration. This is about seeing the performance season not as an endpoint, but as a vibrant and highly visible midpoint. And here the stage is seen as a vital platform, both literally and metaphorically, for meaningful communion, connection, and cross-pollination of culture and ideas. And this is really about using the stage as a platform to showcase sustainability and thinking about materials, but also stories. But I think it's really important to note that not all ecoscenography needs to look like it's sustainable. I think it can be part of the celebration of the work, but it could also be in the way in which the work is framed and discussed in conjunction with the performance. A lot of theatre productions that are sustainable may not necessarily look that way. But I want to focus on some that really focus on the ecological storytelling as part of the sustainability. And this is the work that I did with the Melbourne Arts Centre with a company called Polyglot Theatre in Australia and Oily Cart in the UK, which is which was a work for children with multiple and profound disabilities, children that have the least access to nature, most children in wheelchairs that often don't get a chance to go into the bush at night and really experience what it feels like to be in nature, immersed in nature, but also at nature at night is a very particular experience. And so we basically brought nature to them. So the idea was to use living plants and materials to kind of take over this space in the art center where they were literally immersed with the plants. And I think that, you know, this, and we worked a lot with the biophilic principles to kind of recreate with sound, light, water, texture to kind of really recreate that. So very much a celebration of nature. We can see this also, this is another work by Celia Keyser around, you know, kind of one item, a costume, but has multiple possibilities. So the simplicity of how strong nature is as a resource to us, I think is really important to remember. And I really want to share this as a puppetry piece by Big Country Puppets in Theatre Kimberley. This is in the remote northern end of Australia. And this is a work with First Nations people and First Nations storytelling. And it's actually a collaboration with the local rangers as well. So there's a art science kind of communication part to it. And this idea of the puppets themselves are an important part of telling stories and really communicating values of the region. And so this beautiful connection between the rangers who are the carers of the land and how the puppetry, they're learning puppetry skills as well, and they're also telling the stories as part of that communication of the importance of biodiversity. And then materials themselves can tell a story. In this case, this was a beautiful work with bamboo and using bamboo as a circus material, which is an alternative to a lot of circus materials, which are often made out of steel or, you know, synthetic materials. And what was really amazing about this work is it really changed the way the circus performers worked in terms of their apparatus and the skills. But it also was a celebration of bamboo as something that is a very flexible and strong material and incredibly sustainable, and also evoked a feeling of Southeast Asia. So doing many, many things there. Crown Design's temporary pavilion of mushroom mycelium was a fantastic project that really kind of created this performance space. But what I love particularly about this one in terms of eco-creativity is that it hosted a suite of theatrical events, but mushrooms from the set were harvested every day in front of an audience before being cooked and served up as a meal by a local food truck. So there's a lot of fun in this design and kind of interaction with audiences and kind of really taking that eco-creativity to the edge. And then in terms of mycelium, we've seen some interesting experimentation with this in traditional theatre contexts around using mycelium to create the set design. And you can kind of see an aesthetic kind of emerging out of this. You know, this is kind of the natural aesthetic that's sort of emerging from the mycelium material. And moving on to the next slide, one thing is also interesting to think about, which is kind of looking at electricity and how do you power a show and sustainability around that, not just the materials that you used. And so there have been a number of productions that have looked at renewable technologies, off-the-grid dance performance using solar, bicycle-powered and kinetic energy, and that can also be part of the dramaturgy of the work. And the last stage is circulation, which is all about taking the afterlife of the theatre materials into consideration in the design and construction process. So this is really about design for disassembly. and really thinking about the potential of our refuse as a valuable resource, thinking about, okay, what we might make here, how might it be valuable elsewhere? And again, it comes back to this idea of co-creation, which is about sharing a sharing culture. And it's not just materials, but it's also sharing ideas, sharing networks, sharing tools and strategies. And so you can see that we go from co-creation into celebration, circulation, and back into co-creation. So it's kind of this never-ending cycle. And Marie Renee Bogut Harvey is a Quebecian designer who really works and centers on, thinking about what's going to happen to her work afterwards. She's always creating opportunities with local suppliers and often looking at ways to borrow resources and then return them, or find somebody who may use something after the show. I like this example is interesting to me because Jana Robestad's work, you would look at it and you say, oh, wow, there's a whole bunch of styrofoam on stage, which is not sustainable. But she actually borrowed these styrofoam fish crates from a local salmon factory to help with the to support the telling of the local story. And because it was within a closed loop system, and she was borrowing the styrofoam that already existed from the factory, 5 kilometers away. She was then returning the styrofoam back to the factory and also creating new opportunities for new audiences in terms of the people from the salmon factory also coming to see the show. And then one of the more eco-creative solutions that I've found is the idea of how you might take a set design and then actually create a biodiversity benefit. So this is where, the materials from the set design are also creating these homes for migrating bats. So that's the 3 C's essentially in a nutshell. I want to just share, just to end off, the Living Stage project, which is essentially where the 3 C's kind of developed through my own practice. And the Living Stage is a recyclable, biodegradable, edible, biodiverse performance space that combines community engagement, horticulture, and stage design. And it's really about transforming urban spaces into accessible, equitable, and thriving ecological and social gathering places. And the Living Stage works like this. We grow the stage with a local community. Then we invite the community to come and perform in the space. And then we eat the stage. And then at the end of the performance life, the Living Stage is consumed by its community. Physical structures become garden beds and community spaces, plants become food, and waste becomes compost. And so you can see how the 3 C's are absolutely intertwined in the Living Stage concept. We've done living stages all over the world, and they're always specific to site and community, which means no living stage is ever the same. It's all about site specificity and community engagement. And it's really about thinking the question, it's again through this lens of possibility and opportunity, asking how can we create designs that only enrich our audience, but our community and environment as well. And so just to end off, I guess I ask us to consider, can the coming decades be framed as a time of potential? One where theatre artists rise to the challenge of what it means to bring an ecological perspective into their work, not because they are forced to, but because they embrace the transformative potential that it brings. And I want to end on a quote based on Tony K. Bambara, this idea that the role of the artist is to make the sustainability transition irresistible. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tanya. I feel like we've met only a couple of years ago and we've been traveling similar roads all this time, but you articulate it so beautifully.
Thanks so much, Bryony. I'm excited to learn more about your puppetry practice. Again, I have known about it for many years, but haven't really had the chance to hear you talk about it in great depth.
I'll do that.
Take it away.
All right. So hopefully everyone can see that.
Yeah,
Um,
good.
I yeah, good. All right. I started life as a visual arts student. Um, yeah, uh, and had my first exhibition at the age of 19, which was interactive puppets made out of junk. And instead of an opening, I had a livestock auction. Um, and from that, I became an apprentice puppet maker, which is not a role that is really ever offered in Australia. Maybe that was the only time. And I went into building puppets for main stage theatre productions. So this was a giant, a person would be inside that looking out through the chest to give you an indication of the size for The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Um, and I was shocked to find that at the end of most theatre seasons, the bulk of the material would go into the skip out the back. And the materials that were going into it were also toxic, um, bought new, treated poorly. Um, and moved on to Earth, which is a company based in Sydney, and there was a large chapter of my life devoted to the building of dinosaurs. These again have people inside them, and they were for museums, one in LA and one in Auckland, um, and others. And I started to fiddle with this idea of sort of bringing salvage materials in, but still we were surrounded by solvent-based glues and paints, new materials made of strings of chemicals. Um, these were long lasting. Some of these dinosaurs are still around, but we were still sending a lot of stuff to the bin from the process. So I started, as I got commissions for urban theatre companies around Australia, I started to go deeper into this idea of treating materials as precious resources, and got it to the point where I was using maybe 95% salvage materials. Some things would still be new, hardware, glue, that kind of thing. But even there, I was pulling back, abandoning solvents, and so on. And in this time, I noticed that the narrative shifted. So, where first, like Tanja, I would suggest these things, and people would say, it won't look very good, or that's going to take a really long time, or it's probably going to fall apart or be drab. It changed to people coming to me asking for puppets made in this way because not only do they come with a story embedded in them, but that story can then be told as part of the show. These are some more examples where, so the woman on the left, her face is made from vegetable boxes. And the woman on the right, I started to explore a timber that grew locally just down the road, which I'll talk more about later. Around about this time, I moved to the bush. So I lived in a shed on a hill surrounded by a forest with solar power and rainwater. And my work for urban theatre companies um, started to feel less relevant. I was struggling to connect to the concerns of the theatre and a growing awareness about the bush around me, and the need to sort of connect what I was doing to the community that was becoming very important to me. So I started a project called One Off Makery, and we began with this handful of people from the local area. We collected unsaleable stuffed toys from opportunity shops, and we sat together and disemboweled the teddy bears, and we spun their innards into hundreds of meters of spider web. And then in consultation with a local expert on spiders, we turned the hides of the teddy bears into the giant orb spider that you see above. As a result of that work, I was approached by a regional waste forum, and we started a project which became enormous. It was an immersive forest installation with a surround soundscape, and everything, the forest and the sound, was made from materials that were headed to landfill. And it took us 3 years, and we ended up having almost 1,200 people involved, from preschool students to aged care residents. And we would go into schools or into communities and teach a process. And along the way, in the act of making a mushroom or a curl of bark, we would talk about the idea behind the project, which is that a forest is a living example of an endlessly sustainable system, because there is no such thing as waste, and every dead thing is just an opportunity for new life. And therefore, it's totally possible for us. Um, and we evaluated that project and found that almost 94% of participants said that they had come away from the project thinking differently about their own attitude to consumption and waste. And that's not because we at any point lectured, but they felt that that had occurred to them spontaneously in the act of making this forest together. The Frugal Forest toured to 7 regional galleries. 60,000 people saw it, and quite a high proportion of the visitors in some places would walk in, and it'd be a whole family with a kid saying, "I made this forest." Then I went really deep into materials, and I made an entire festival of baling twine. Baling twine is a type of cord that's used to tie up hay bales. And in Australia, at least, you'll see big snarls of it tangled on the fences and blowing into waterways. It's treated with disdain. So we collected several kilometres of baling twine and made a day-long festival. And this little girl is helping to build an architecture of string. A few years ago, I moved to Lutruwita, Tasmania, where I am speaking to you from now. It's the unceded lands of the Palawa and Pakana people. And I moved here to work with Terrapin Puppet Theatre. And I became the lead maker and head of workshop. And in that time, we built 6 shows, some roving shows, some schools touring shows, some shows for theatre. And as head of workshop, I tried to both use and teach the sustainable approach to materials that I'd been developing. And that's had varying success, I would say. So all of the puppets in the paper escaper were made from either salvage material or post-consumer waste, unbleached paper, and mist-tinted house paints, which were then repigmented and applied. The set, it's a different crew, more difficult to set a high bar there. Feathers was finished this year, and all of the puppets are about 95% salvaged materials. There are people inside these ones too. And Heap was a project which I shared the creation of the character with a local school. And even though we had only a few hours together, we spent some time going through their compost heap with a fork and finding out what lived in there and marveling at all of the life and the forms and the colors. And in the process of doing that, the kids became really invested in the compost heap. So where when I arrived, I had imagined that this compost character would be a little like Carmen Miranda, sort of brittle and bright and easily collapsed and prone to singing. When I came away, the kids had such a strong feeling that the compost heap should be protected and that it was at once a child and an old person and carried wisdom beyond our knowing, and that there must be a gardener who could interpret for it. So even just that limited time of sharing the idea with young people really affected the outcome. And then the finished puppet went back to their school to be shown to them as the first audience. And heap was made again from 95% salvage materials. In the time in the workshop, I also taught those principles, as well as the principles of puppet design and construction. And the more I worked in the workshop on the approach to materiality, the more I realized that materials are really a drop in the ocean of performances, environmental impact. So looking at company operations, by doing our first carbon audit a few years ago, we realized that far and away the biggest sources of emissions were from freight and from travel and from audiences coming to see the shows. And that led to my thinking that to have any effect here, materials is not enough, and actually we have to push it upstream. We have to think about how projects are designed, and then further upstream, we have to think about what is it that we think is important enough to what stories are important enough to tell, and do we all agree, and whose voices are in the room anyway when they say yes, that's important. So I started to make let me see here. I attempted to make a revised version of the waste hierarchy. The traditional one is reduce, reuse, recycle. In my version, we have many more layers, hopefully all connected. And it begins with reflection and hopefully thinking about whose voices should participate in the choices that we make. And works its way down. And here we have redesign and can materials inform design? And here again, this sort of upends the traditional theatre process where writer sends the script to the director, who briefs the designer, who comes up with a concept on paper, sends it to the workshop, and then it arrives on stage. In a material informed design process, everyone needs to be in the room at the start to decide what do we value and when is it worth it. And then the makers need to be able to communicate freely with the designer and test and research their materials and their sources and feed that into the design process so that there's a circular communication open to everyone that informs the whole process. Which leads me to process. So I describe my practice as frugality in the sense that there are other ways to be sustainable. Working with purity, for example, using materials that are of the earth and return to the earth is another approach. Working ephemerally by reordering and then returning materials. But mine has sprung from an awareness that there's an endless stream of crap going to landfill. And if we can divert it for a time and give it a rich life, tell stories with it that matter, then that is for the good. So these are some of the practices that come into that. Identifying waste streams is really useful because finding a single object is not often worth designing for, but if you know that you can get large volumes of it, then suddenly it becomes interesting and applicable. Buying secondhand, using offcuts, remnants and seconds, reusing and repurposing. So all of these things require strategic hoarding, like storing things that you know are going to be useful, or having excellent networks of people and places and stashes that you can call on. And industrial ecology is a great term that a friend of mine introduced me to. She briefly had a role as an industrial ecology officer, and her job was to find waste streams industrially and hook them up with manufacturers who needed those materials. So in this version, it's making relationships with the people around you and developing a mental map of where the stuff is and how you can tap into it. And again, letting materials inform the design. So doing it on paper is all very well, but fiddling in the workshop is actually a crucial part of the early stage design process. And developing techniques. So really having a broad scope of skills and tools. They don't have to be elaborate, but applying techniques in unique ways. So I know how to weld and sew and build in timber and paint and sculpt, and any of those techniques could be applied to any material in new ways. What that's meant in the workshop, I won't read them all, but these are some of the things that I came to. All of them are sort of designed either to take advantage of existing waste streams or eliminating harmful chemicals, or finding replacements for things that are resource intensive. So, for example, aluminium is thoroughly recyclable, but it's also a vanishing resource. And so I looked for local alternatives and ended up growing my own bamboo on the property, which has since become the structure inside all of my large-scale puppets. And another one was looking for lightweight materials that could eliminate either styrofoam or balsa wood, which comes usually from tropical rainforest. And I discovered that there was a mill down the road. Meet Steve Wagg, owner of the mill. So the Waggs planted a Paulownia plantation in the 1980s, thinking that it would be a miracle crop. And it turned out not to be a miracle, but instead to be an invasive weed. So they're stuck with it. But it turns out that this timber is incredibly light, slightly heavier than balsa wood, but many times stronger and very workable. So a few kilometers down the road, I can source milled timber. And knowing that that resource was readily and steadily available and investigating its properties meant that I could develop a relationship with it. And that relationship has gone for years and will probably go for the rest of my making life, and has resulted in developing a new technique for making the understructures of puppets. So this is Paulownia. It's a skull that holds a mechanism for beak and eye movement, and it's skinned with a type of paper I found a roll of paper beside the road many years ago, which must be 12 kilometers of paper. That also will last the rest of my life. So I've developed a relationship with this paper as well. It forms an excellent skin on the balsa wood. And now I teach these techniques to my young mentors and apprentices, and I give them some of the paper and I give them the phone number of the polonium mill. One thing about using salvage material is that the cost is minimal, but generally the labor is more because there's more transformation. And I often find that I do very repetitive processes of applying, say, strands of fur. But this in itself is an act of meditation, and in the process of it, I develop a very deep appreciation for the qualities of those materials and also think about all of the energy and processes and knowledge that went into the creation of that material, which may then be discarded, but actually carries so much invested energy and innate presence. It's hard to explain. Tanja Beer would do it better. Also integral to these processes is including people in the work of it. So not only do salvage materials carry the stories of a past life into the creatures or objects that you make, but also the process becomes embedded in that object. So if you include people in the process, and if the process itself is enjoyable, if people find things to marvel at in it or learn about their strengths and failings in repetition or precision and laugh about it with the people next to them, all of those things are embedded in the object and go with it onto stage or wherever it's destined. And I think that's part of, alongside aiming to make things that last a long time and are well used and well loved, carrying those stories of the materials and the people who made them is just as important. I may have spoken quite fast, but how are we doing for time?
I think we're pretty good. I think it's good we've got more time for discussion actually. So, yeah, I don't think I think it's fine. I think I was a bit fast as well.
I think
Um,
perhaps after discussion, I can talk a little about introduce the materials investigation. I have some things to show here. Shall we open to questions?
yeah, I'd love to open to questions. Does anybody have any questions? No questions yet. I'm trying to think
Feel,
of a
feel free to write them in the sidebar if
Yeah,
you're
actually, that's a
hesitant to
good thing. If you want to write it in the chat, that might be less overwhelming sometimes.
yeah.
Um,
Can I ask you one question?
yes, please.
I was thinking about did you have some kind of specific turning point when you kind of decided to make this shift for a more ecological approach, and what did this new approach what kind of new things did it bring to your art? What did it give it more? How did it affect your art?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Who wants to go first? Do you want me to go first, Bryony? Yeah, okay. Um, it's really hard to say whether there was one turning point. I think it was a shock. It was certainly a shift over a period of years, I would say. Um, full disclosure, I'm married to an ecologist. So that definitely means that I'm much more aware of ecological issues, because my husband works on an endangered species of frog, very local to the region that we used to live in, Melbourne, in Australia. And what's quite interesting is there's been many moments, but one moment was the fact that this is a frog, the growling grass frog, which is threatened. It's a threatened species, and it is threatened by a number of factors, but one of them is urbanization, and increasing urbanization of the city into the countryside. And they are very it's a species that needs a lot of different wetlands. It needs a system, not just one wetland, it needs a system of wetlands in order to support its survival. So it needs many wetlands, and they need to be a certain distance apart, actually. So a kind of connected water system, so that they can thrive. And I remember that my husband came back home one day very distraught, and he basically told me that they were getting rid of a beautiful wetland, very important for the frog, because they were making way. They were making way not for housing, which you would think, often it is housing developments, but they were actually making way for a landfill site. So they were because we need more landfill sites to get rid of all our rubbish. They were taking up valuable frog habitat. And yeah, it was a real interesting moment of my set designs that I knew were going to landfill. Also, our two worlds, which are quite separate in many ways, coming together on this issue. That, this kind of connection with this ecological problem that is very real and very close to home, and then my set designs as well. So, there are many moments, but that is one that I might share as a kind of turning point for me, saying that the reality really kind of was felt. And then in terms of the question of how has it changed my art practice, I would say that I'm a much, much better designer. I'm a much better designer. I mean, I would say that the aesthetics of my design have shifted, but I think one of the things that has shifted a lot in my work is I work a lot more closely with communities. I work a lot more closely with audiences and participants. A lot of opportunities and serendipitous possibilities have emerged because I work in a much more agile and place-specific way. I've met people that I wouldn't normally have met. It's changed who I am as a person for the better. Every project is an opportunity to be a better human, even though I make lots of mistakes all the time, constantly making mistakes, but learning from that process makes me feel more connected to the world around me. Because for me, again, it comes, there's this argument about, what is, theatre's carbon footprint, you could argue is a lot lower than other industries. But for me, it's about working with my value system. I don't feel good when I create a lot of waste. I don't feel good. It actually makes me feel ill, like sick in the stomach. And that's where I got to. I thought maybe I have to leave the industry because I couldn't live with this kind of way of working. It made me feel, unwell, physically and mentally unwell to work in this way. As a very values-orientated person. So that is a big driver for me, is working with my value system. That is what makes me happy in my life. As much as always thinking that everybody's got to be part of the solving being part of the solution, and also thinking that theatre, performing arts more generally, should be a leader in this space. Yeah. Bryony, do you want to answer? I think that's probably good.
Yeah, I think multiple moments of dawning realization, but probably the first one would have been at the age of 16, seeing someone at the checkout with a pear in a plastic bag and asking for a carry bag. And I summoned up the courage to say, "Do you need that bag?" And she went, "Talk to the hand," kind of thing. And I was mortified. And from there started thinking there must be ways in the world to lead people there with people get so defensive and attacked when their ways of life are challenged. Can we flip it around so that we lead people there with creative discovery or a feeling of revelation or wonder? Yes, it's been a long road trying to get to that, but it started a long time ago. Another big moment was coming out of a main stage theatre production and at the end of the season and seeing the entire set just crumpled into the skip at the back of the theatre. Yes. And another one during the Frugal Forest project where we'd worked intricately with these materials with over 1,000 people for nearly 3 years. And when we weighed it in order to take it on tour, we realized that it was probably about 17 minutes worth of dumping at our local small town rubbish dump. So just the sheer volumes of material that artwork itself is never going to make a dent in those materials, but what it can do is shift culture, and that's our job, really. Yeah. We have some great questions down the chat bar here. Shall we? So the first one, how do you ensure longevity in the projects? Maybe I'll start and
That'll be good,
throw to
Bryony,
you.
because I think there's a few questions around longevity, which I think would be good, that are quite specific to puppetry, that I think would be great
Yeah,
for you to
okay.
delve into.
Okay. Yes, I find that my puppets have worked and continue to work for a long time. So the first one that I showed you, Rumble Buffin the Giant, which was made in 1998 or something, is still on the road and has been sold on numerous times. I met someone at a party who said, "I just bought this giant," and yeah, it was Rumble Buffin. I think because of the deep experimentation and invention and application of processes, I've tried to develop ways of working that minimize weight and also minimize wear. So I've ended up doing a lot of lashing and binding and macheting, which means that all sorts of different materials can be bonded. The lashing means that it's a mechanical joint, so you can join plastic to metal, whatever. The mache means that it's immobilized so that hardware and things don't wear holes loose and there's no weak points in the material. That in turn allows the structural materials to be lighter, which reduces strain. And so I find that they generally last longer than most puppets. And then patience with process. So just making sure that, stitches are well finished, those kinds of things, care and attention really means that they hold their own for longevity. And Tanja?
Yes, I'm just thinking what else are there. Just moving on to the next question. Sorry. We have a question about, could you share your experience of how you negotiate the process with other members of the production to pursue your value of sustainability? For example, challenges, timelines, and budgets. How we negotiate, how obviously when theatre making of any kind is a collaborative process. So, and you're not always making everything yourself. So you have other people making things or other people navigating different areas of the production. I have to say, I do think that sometimes that can be really hard because you don't want to be like holding out your finger and explaining these things. And certainly, I feel often if I come on board as an artist with other artists, it really needs to be coming from the company standpoint, that is what the company values and that it's almost embedded in policy. It is kind of like, this is how we want to work. But even when that has been part of the company's sort of focus, I have noticed that designers, they're just not used to working, other designers, for example, lighting designers or other designers, aren't always used to working in that way. And so they'll often go to the most immediate choice that they always go to, which is some sort of, suddenly ordering things from China. And you're like, hang on a minute, where did that come from? Why are we ordering things from China now? There is in that transition to thinking in a more sustainable way. It is actually quite difficult because there's a lot of learnt things from our training, and experienced designers have a system and a way of working, and we're often asking them to maybe reconsider some well-honed systems and ways of working, which can be quite challenging. So yeah, it is not an easy process. And I don't enjoy, even though I am an eco-sonographer, I don't enjoy telling people that maybe that's not the best choice. I certainly shy away from confrontation. So often where I have the possibility, I often like to have opportunity to be part of the selection of the artists on a project, an artist that I know will be open to working in this way or already work in this way. But at the same time, we also need to be guiding and encouraging artists who haven't worked in this way before to also come on board. But yeah, it is a process. And can I just say, I think people often ask me, is it harder, takes more time to work in a sustainable way? And I would tell you now, after more than 10 years, I would say 10, 15 years of doing this, it doesn't take me any longer than if I was to follow a traditional design process. It doesn't cost any more than if I was to follow a traditional design process. If anything, it probably potentially saves time and money, but that's because I've been developing this way of working for over 10, 15 years. So it's just the way I work now. It's just completely the way I work now. But that has taken time. And it's not to mean that I'm perfect. I always make mistakes, but I guess because as I'm learning, and then I'm like, oh, okay, next time I'm not going to do that. I'll do something different. So every project is an opportunity to kind of find new solutions. And for me, I think what Bryony was talking about before is it's an opportunity to experiment and find, it's like a problem-solving exercise in many ways. And I find that through that process, I often become more creative and come up with more creative solutions because I'm constantly questioning and rethinking the way to do something. Bryony, did you want to add to that in any way?
Yeah, sure. And then I might address the solvents and glues question as well.
Oh, yes, that's very
So
specific. Yes. Yep.
So yes, so with the creative team, this is a question that I've been grappling with at Terrapin for quite a while, trying to find how to make an organizational way of operating that facilitates this. And to date, it's been quite reliant on individual passion and individual knowledge to pull it off. And so when you bring new people into the relationship, maybe they have other priorities. Maybe they don't have that knowledge set. And so it feels confusing, difficult, like a series of hurdles. And so we've really changed the plan at Terrapin, going from, lists of forbidden materials or mandates for a fixed percentage of recycled materials. We're trying now a version where you start with a roundtable meeting with all the people involved and you set the rules of the game and everyone discusses until you agree. So let's say it's a show where we're really going to lean into bringing the freight to as close to zero as we can. So the decisions by everyone, the director, the writer, the designer, the makers, are going to lead to that aim. So we're going to make material choices. We're going to envision the show. We're going to write the stage directions with the idea that we'll have very little, that perhaps it's performers and a suitcase full of stuff. That might be a very different brief to saying, yes, this show, because of the nature of the story that we're going to tell, the rule of the game is that everything is going to be biodegradable. And so that would completely change your material choices, but also your directorial decisions and your budgeting choices and your how the writer conceives of the characters. So getting everyone in the room, getting everyone to agree at the beginning really helps to make those decisions less muddy. And then wherever possible, having the resources, the material scorecards and cheat sheets so that people can build their knowledge over time. Also making relationships that last. So the more that you work with the same people over time, the more you pull knowledge and the more you can push it. So next time you work together, maybe you can set the bar a little higher. Just acknowledging that this is an endlessly ongoing process, and there's no arrival, but also that means making it punitive is not helpful. Ultimately, we need to bring people into the rules of the game and help them to see that it's an exciting, creative pressure cooker, not an obstacle. Yeah.
Yeah, that's true.
Glues.
Glues.
Yeah. So, yeah, good question. I met a glue about 20 years ago, which completely has changed all the workshops that I work in, which has eliminated solvent-based contact adhesives, which is probably the main sort of chemical punishment that makers are subjected to. Here it is called 2KH2O bond, but its name has changed multiple times. And it is a water-based neoprene glue. You sponge it onto both surfaces, and then you have a catalyst, which is zinc zinc hydrochloride in water, which breaks the bond between the neoprene and the water evaporates off. It leaves a very, like, you use hardly any of it, and it's completely odorless and rated as no harm to waterways, etc., etc. And yeah, it's completely workshop transforming. Only available here in 20-litre drums, but I would be very curious to know if it's available in Europe. I have just banned aerosol spray cans altogether. We just design them out. It's not that
Me
hard.
too. I can tell you that is like my non-negotiable.
Yeah. And then for color, wherever I can, I use found color. So it's not surface applied and it's not dyed. And I actually have found now that I find it hard to look at a painted surface in theatre. I find it quite superficial and samey, and color that comes from embedded in the material is much richer. But where I do need to change colors, I've found ways of working with pigmented drawing inks, and I dampen the fabric and then I squeeze the drawing ink through it so that I'm not washing any ink down the drain. It's all in the material when it dries. Yes, I will write the name of the glues in the chat bar. What else?
I was just thinking, Bryony,
and then
oh, sorry.
Just the other one is process based. So reducing the reliance on glue, stitching where you can, joining mechanically, that kind of thing. And reducing the use of materials. So, for example, if you're using foams that might come from old mattresses, that kind of thing, pattern cutting thin sheets of it rather than carving down huge blocks of it. So you end up with mountains of offcuts and a big solid lump of foam. You can reduce both your offcuts and your weight by using pattern cutting processes instead.
I was just going
Feel
to
free
say,
to,
Bryony, I was
yeah.
just going to say, it's so interesting when I just hear about like these things that you do. I'm like, oh my God, I do them too. I try to avoid painting because,
Yeah.
yeah, I just think if I can find the colors, and I just work with what I find, and it's not often the color I had in my head, but often it's better. Anyway, yeah, and spray paint is something that I had some horrific experience with spray paint because I think when you think about toxic to the environment, things like adhesives, like glues, you can smell the toxicity. It's not, I think some things, materials that we use, we can't tell straight away that it's going to be bad for the environment. They might seem quite benign, but with sprays and glues that we can smell, we can smell that it's bad for us as humans. So just imagine how bad it's going to be for the environment. I think it's always this like warning is like, you're just putting I'm just breathing in toxicity. If I have to wear a mask, filtration mask, then I'm like, I'm doing the wrong thing. Yeah. I
Then
mean, sometimes I have to
the
wear a
world needs
mask.
one too.
Yeah, sometimes you have to wear a mask for dust and things like that. That's a different issue. But because dust exists, and if you're working with reclaimed materials, that's another thing. But in terms of like breathing in toxic chemicals, to me, it's like the ultimate I don't know, it's the ultimate contrast to what I value, I suppose. I wanted to get back to what Rachel said in terms of longevity in projects. And I think often when we're working in traditional theatre contexts, we think about everything has to look the same across a season of performances, right? We have to keep everything the same. And this is particularly difficult in like something like costume, particularly a dancer who is wearing the same costume and performing in it and sweating. Obviously you'll need to have a lot of longevity in the dyes that you create for the costume and the way you put the costume together. Interesting, like the work that Ingvild Fossheim has been doing in her work around biocolor has been around the costume actually changing across the performances and actually allowing for that change to happen and saying why, if you think about dancers, they always have to find something different every night. They're performing the same thing again and again on a long touring system. They have to perform the same thing. They're always looking for something slightly different every night to inspire them to go out on stage. Why does the costume always have to be 100% the same? Is that a question that we can ask, that it can actually evolve with the performance? Because if you look at biocolor that you use in costumes and dyeing, they do slowly, that's what happens. They do slowly through the wash and through sweat fade away. But is that such a bad thing all the time? Could that be part of the way the performance is? Performance is an ephemeral art form. Is there a way in which we can also embrace the ephemerality as well? I think there is a question that we also missed, which was how, and I'll go over to you, Bryony. How important is the backstage story of scenography approach at the moment when performance meets audience? Is this part of the public story about performance or not each time?
So just speaking about my work, my aim has been that it's not at the forefront, that first and foremost people see and appreciate a well-made object that might have rich or unusual surfaces. But the story comes later. So because I work primarily in theatre for young people, there's often learning resources or Q&As after the show or backstage videos made, and that's when the story of the materials and the process come through. And that's actually become a strength working with companies around Australia who work with young people, that their learning resources are enriched by the stories of the materials.
Yeah, I would say the same thing. I think we've got to be careful to assume that something, just because it's sustainable, it has to look sustainable, whatever that means. And I think one thing that we need to be aware of is that, you know, sustainability in any kind of theatre production can be as diverse as any theatre production. You know, there are a large number of different kinds of aesthetics. And one of the reasons I show all the different examples from all the different designers across the world around, you know, these sustainability aesthetics is you can tell that they all look quite different, you know, that they're just as diverse as normal theatre productions. Some are more, I think, you know, there is an ecological aesthetic that can emerge, but doesn't have to. And for example, you know, the set design with the styrofoam is an interesting one because you just wouldn't think that it, you know, it was done within a sustainable framework. Um, but it was. And I think there's, you know, that can also challenge the audience a little bit to think about it. So that's where I think, you know, a sustainability statement in a program or outside the theatre or a Q&A can be really valuable in terms of, or even through the media around the project, because it is actually I think audiences really like to hear how things are made. Anyway, they find it always really interesting, like the backstage of how theatre production is made, because it's always meant to be so magical. And the way we make theatre is often not revealed, and all the labor that goes into that, I think, is often something that sparks curiosity. And so I find that audiences are very receptive to talking about behind the scenes. And also, they're often really surprised and excited to see this beautiful artifact, this beautiful object, this beautiful puppet that was created was made using, you know, reclaimed school uniforms, which is what Bryony is going to present in a little while as well. Is like things that you find, you know, that, you know, there's a connection to the object and a surprise factor. So yeah, I don't think we take it advantage of that enough in terms of audience engagement.
Couldn't have made that segue better because I think
Yes.
we've yeah. Thank you for the very interesting questions, everyone. And I think we just have time to introduce the workshop after the break. So I would like to tell you the story of a particular material as a lead-in to this workshop. Um, I am currently working on a commission for a very large body puppet, which is a green furred beast. I can't divulge anymore for confidence reasons, but this beast will be representing the state, let's say. And and when I was thinking about what materials could be the fur for this very large beast, it needs to be in large quantities. It needs to be found color to eliminate dyeing and painting. And ideally, the story of that material will embed into the creature that I'm making in a meaningful way. And so I started to look at school uniforms, which I don't know in Finland or wherever everyone is, but this is a school uniform from Australia. They're probably one of the most unexciting garments you can imagine. But
Yep.
in looking at them, I have developed a deep appreciation for school uniforms because the design of them is color fast. It doesn't fray. It dries quickly. It's if you cut it, it behaves in a very interesting way. It has just enough rigidity that it bounces in a way that I find very appealing. So from this investigation and from thinking about the sources of it, schools in Australia usually have a second-hand school uniform pool where people bring in their old school uniforms and they can be sold on to people who have a low budget. But always things come in that are stained or torn and can't be sold. And so that was going to be my waste stream, by contacting the schools and asking them for their unsaleable school uniforms in the right colours. And from there, I started to do a materials investigation looking at different ways of making fur out of them. And because I knew that this beast was going to have about 5 square meters of skin, I knew that weight would be critical. And so I actually made samples and then weighed a standardized square of them and found that one process that I developed weighed less than half of the next most promising process. So I settled on this one. And then I standardized my procedure. First, you disassemble the school top and then you cut it into strips. And then you stitch it in rows onto a backing fabric until you have fur like this. And then I went to a high school on the outskirts of Hobart and I taught high school students how to cut devil fur using these templates. Very repetitive process. Some kids loved it and some kids were more like, oh, what is this? But we had a lot of fun and I learned so much about teenage life on the outskirts of Hobart, and made some beautiful connections and hopefully seeded some ideas in their minds about other ways that you could be a grown-up in this world, because possibly they have never met a puppet maker. So that is the story of school uniforms. And I have a provocation for you, but don't be frightened. Please come back after the break because you don't have to talk if you don't want to. But I'll just try to share my screen. So my provocation to you is to find a material during the break. It doesn't have to be spectacular. It doesn't even have to be promising. We can find its promise or we can realize that it doesn't have one. But when we come back,
There's
we'll be asking these questions.
Sorry, Bryony. I think there's
Yeah,
something
no good.
blocking the view a little bit.
Looks like a piece of fabric actually over the.
Oh, there you go.
It's also on the other side, Bryony. It's very strange. It's like
Yeah,
this
on the right.
like piece of fabric on the like it feels like uniform fabric that is covering a fabric swatch.
Is it some other windows or some other like
That's it, yeah.
I will just. Oh, is that helping?
No,
oh
no.
on the top, yeah.
That was strange. All right, I'll just try again.
I almost thought it was intentional with your like it looked like little sort of like uniform fabric scraps, but I was like, I don't think it's meant
Oh
to
wow, no, really not intentional. I'm just going to tell you, when we come back, we will look at the materials and we will ask of those materials, what is it made of? Where does it come from? What does it do? What can I do to it? What could it be? And where will it go? And it doesn't matter if some of those questions are unanswerable. And we will do it together. You won't be on your own. And I will start by demonstrating with a knitting needle. So I think now we have a 15-minute break.
So
Perfect.
the idea, just to repeat, just in case anybody might have missed it, we're asking everybody to go and find a material or an object. Is that right? Anything that they can find in the room where they are, in the home where they are, lying around, and just bring it back. And if they're kind of confused, they can bring back 2 things. But generally, it's something that grabs your curiosity. Don't overthink it. Is that what we're thinking? Yeah. Great.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Tanja and Bryony. And I'm here.
Great.
Now let's have a 15-minute break and see you soon.
Great. Amazing.